From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson. And I'm a little ashamed to say it's just Robert Ferguson this week. I had intended to have another guest on, but they had to postpone, so that'll be a few weeks from now. So it's just me this week, which is maybe good and maybe bad. One of the reasons it's good is that there's a topic that I really hoped to discuss, and it was an episode that I kinda wanted to do on my own because I was hoping that I could talk it through. It's also perhaps a little bit controversial. This is one of those issues that is likely to create emotion on both sides. It directly deals with the myths that are at the center of this country's founding. Um, Today I'm going to talk about the Constitution and to a lesser extent, the American Revolution and slavery. This has been an issue that has Um, shall I say, invited heated responses from people who are either absolutely committed to the notion that the United States is a racist country, and on the other hand, people who are absolutely committed to preserving the sanctity of of these countries' institutions. It's a tricky subject, and so I recognize that because of those emotions on both sides, the issue has to be dealt with great care. Um, I can't pretend that I'm gonna do it perfectly. This is me thinking through a problem as much as anything else, hopefully giving you my insight, but it will probably be one of those podcasts that satisfies nobody. Um, it I am also not a historian of the American founding. I'm a 20th century historian who researches things like credit, debt, and political factions that engaged in 1920s, 30s, and 40s politics. Now, while that might be of interest to some people, I expect it's not really of interest to a broad audience. This subject probably is. So I admit that that while I'm not an amateur, I am perhaps not the professional you need to handle this subject matter. Imagine me being I'm a right-handed pitcher coming out of the bullpen to deal with a left-handed power hitter, perhaps. So I I I'm aware of that. I want the audience to be aware of that, and I hope that in future to be able to bring on guests that either criticize my conclusions, add further insight, or can maybe recharacterize them in some way. But I do think this is a useful discussion, and hopefully, if nothing else, this is probably a subject we're going to return to in later episodes. It can provide myself and listeners with a useful foundation for analyzing this difficult subject. I think it has become so consumed by politics in recent years that we might have lost sight of some of the facts. So, anyway, without further ado, I'm gonna jump into this. Uh, this subject became particularly potent. With the publication of something called the 1619 Project back in 2019 by New York Times Magazine. It was published by a group of historians, journalists, and activists that were trying to restructure the American founding around the institution of slavery. The idea being the United States never stood for freedom, never stood for anything that resembled real liberty, but in fact was always about preserving and maintaining racist institutions. Therefore, by calling it 1619, the idea was that we should trace America's founding not to 1776, not to the Declaration of Independence, not to the beginning of the Revolutionary War, but to the arrival of the first African slaves into the colonies that eventually become the United States. 1619 is a year in which a group of Africans arrive on a Dutch ship. I believe it was a Dutch ship into Jamestown in Virginia, and they are first sold. Um, this certainly is the establishment of the institution of slavery in the United States. Before that, there was something. Before that, and also alongside with it for a very, very long time and for several more centuries, was a an institution called indentured servitude. This is there have been a lot of discussions on what the difference is between indentured servitude and slavery. One of the primary distinctions is that you're not going to inherit indentured servitude, but if you're a slave, it's a status that can be inherited. And in the United States, in the various states, in the colonies previously, it was inherited matrilineally, which meant that if your mother was a slave, you would be a slave, unless otherwise free. Indentured servants were usually people who came over from Europe, oftentimes from the British Isles, but not exclusively from the British Isles, who were seeking a better life in America, seeking refuge from something. And they would come to a contract with a landowner somewhere in the colonies that would become the United States, and they would bound themselves to a period of labor in return for passage across the Atlantic, some shelter, and then some startup money for a farm of their own once their term of service ended. Indentured servitude was along with Indian slavery in Virginia, was the way that the Virginia colony began. I'm admittedly less familiar with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I know indentured servitude existed there, but I don't actually know the degree to which it was the foundation of the economy. Again, an expert on the Massachusetts Bay Colony would be able to tell you a lot more. I do know that in Virginia, especially when they started growing tobacco, and that was really what allowed for the initial success of the Jamestown colony. Indentured servitude was at the heart of their labor force. In 1619, when these African slaves arrive, initially there's no real legal separation between them and other indentured servants. There's a lot of unclear historical evidence, we'll put it that way, as to whether or not this initial group of Africans that were sold into Virginia were treated like indentured servants or were immediately treated like slaves. But we do know that by the 1660s, I think Virginia has a slave code that deals specifically with African slaves. And the slave experience is a brutal one. There is no getting around that. There have been attempts over the years, especially by, uh, um, especially by a certain group of historians. Some of them are Southern, but not all of them are Southern, that tried to present American slavery as somehow maybe not benevolent, but not that bad, I guess is the way I could characterize it. There was this notion of benevolent slaveholders, that Slaves were treated like either like extended members of the family and then later, once slaves became to have a whole lot of value inherent in them, it was believed that these were good, that if nothing else, the self-interest of the planter guaranteed that the slave would be looked after. And in a lot of this material, they try to compare the life of the slave to the life of the poor industrial worker in the North. The idea being that the slave had a degree of security that the Northern worker did not, and that in fact the standard of living of the slave was better than industrial workers. There's a lot of material on this. There's been a lot of study on this. I don't have it handy. I actually intended to have it handy, but I forgot to have it handy. Um, that looks at standard of living of slavery versus standard of living in the industrial North. The evidence is it's difficult to compile these statistics and to come up with a clear picture, but the reality is that liberty was always better than slavery. And the slave in the American South, some appear to have been treated fairly well, most were treated badly, but no matter what, even if you were treated, you know, by, relatively well, you were always in danger of being sold somewhere worse. Your children were at threat of being sold. Your wife or husband were at threat, could have been sold. Your brothers and sisters could have been sold. And there were certainly any number of slave owners who were willing to countenance severe corporal discipline, um, some torture uh, of slaves. So this was a brutal institution. What does separate American slavery, though, from slavery in, say, South America is in the United States, there is a growing slave population. I believe the number is only about 450,000 slaves that were officially imported from Africa, and that I don't know if that accounts for smuggling numbers or not. But by the end of the Civil War, you've got over 4 million American slaves, which means that there was population growth. And again, this kind of leads to the idea that if you have population growth, well, maybe slavery wasn't that bad. Again, I think that's a bit of a silly argument, but I think you could argue that the American slavery as it existed, particularly in the Cotton Belt, depending on where you ended up, it could have been better than other examples of slavery in the Americas. But that's pretty slim consolation. But anyway, slavery begins in that kind of middle decades of the 17th century, and it becomes an embedded institution fairly quickly all across the American colonies, but particularly in the American South. The American South is the breadbasket of the British Empire, particularly for the sugar colonies in the Caribbean. The United States, the colonies aren't growing sugar in the colonial period. The Americans don't really start growing sugar until after the Louisiana Purchase, with the uh, annexation of New Orleans, and then later on with Florida. So in the 17th and 18th and 17th and 18th centuries, there's no sugar being grown, but sugar is the most important slave cash crop being grown in the British Empire, and that they're being grown across the West Indies. However, the West Indies needs to be fed, and the place that it is fed from is typically the American South, which is growing a lot of rice. And so if you ever go to the South Carolina and Georgia coast, you will see that there is a great degree of rice being sold. Meanwhile, in North Carolina and Virginia, you'll see more tobacco. but the breadbasket is South Carolina and Georgia, and South Carolina at one point, owing to its status of the breadbasket of the British Empire, is I believe, the wealthiest spot on earth in the 18th century. Of course, in the 19th century, the slave economy in the United States will be dominated by what's called upland short staple cotton. The 1619 project, um, one of its big errors, and this is acknowledged probably even by the authors itself at this point, although they don't acknowledge much, but I think this mistake even they're willing to acknowledge, was that they argue that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. That claim does not really pass muster. Um, and one of the reasons that I think I can confidently refute that claim is that many of the American founders, even the ones that were slaveholders, wished to be able to, they wished to be able to abolish slavery in the Americas. They recognized the hypocrisy of, on the one hand, fighting for freedom, and on the other hand, fighting for freedom and maintaining this institution, this barbaric institution. Um, and we know we have to go no further than Thomas Jefferson himself, who, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Declaration of Independence that most of the readers know, was the second draft. There was an initial draft, a first draft. And in that first draft, there was an additional paragraph. And the additional paragraph read like this: He has waged cruel war, speaking of George III, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain an execrable commerce, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished thy. That's Thomas Jefferson, a man who himself owned slaves. Jefferson was also arguably the most impressive philosopher of liberty that was associated with the American Revolution. There are lots of theories as to how Jefferson could hold these two ideas in his head at the same time. This notion that all men are created equal and therefore entitled to certain natural rights, while at the same time countenancing not only the continuation of the institution, the continuation of slavery, but holding slaves himself. Again, there's lots of theories as to why this happened, why this great act of hypocrisy occurred. And the best answer I've seen is that Jefferson didn't think it was good for himself politically. He thought that if he freed his slaves, it would destroy his political career. Now, that might explain why he doesn't free his slaves in the 1790s when he still wants to be president, but after his presidency, I'm not sure it does a very good job of explaining it. It could have been as simple that for Monticello to work, he needed their labor, and he didn't know any other way to do it. It's a very tricky subject. It's a touchy subject. And of course, Jefferson himself was not the only slave owner who was a prominent founding father. George Washington owned slaves. James Madison owned slaves, and George Mason owned slaves. And yet, many of them opposed slavery. It's not just Jefferson. George Washington once said, "There's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." George Mason, who I believe might have been one of the wealthiest and largest slave owners at the Constitutional Convention, said, quote, "That slow poison is daily contaminating the minds and morals of our people. Every gentleman here is born a petty tyrant. Practiced in acts of despotism and cruelty, we become callous to the dictates of humanity and all the finer feelings of the soul. Taught to regard a part of our own species in the most abject and contemptible degree below us, we lose that idea of dignity of man which the hand of nature has implanted in us for great and useful purposes." That's George Mason. James Madison, meanwhile, said, quote, "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of times a ground for the most oppressive domination ever exercised by man over man." And that was at the Constitutional Convention. He also said, quote, "The magnitude of this evil," by which he means slavery, "among us is so deeply felt and so universally acknowledged that no merit could be greater than that of devising a satisfactory remedy for it." This was not mere rhetoric either. I really do think that the American Revolution was fought in spite of slavery, certainly not for it. And the Constitution itself was drafted and ratified to account for slavery, not to preserve it. It was genuinely believed, I think, that in the 1780s, slavery was going to die a slow death, at least hoped, by most of the people that were at the Constitutional Convention. Not all. There were attempts from two delegates from South Carolina to get a pro-slavery clause inserted in the Constitution, but James Madison and others worked feverishly against it. They did not want slavery in the Constitution. Now, anybody who knows the subject, when I say that they didn't want slavery in the Constitution, will say, no, slavery appears in the Constitution. It appears in 3 places. And they are correct. Well, kind of correct. It really appears certainly in one place, which is where the Constitution agrees that there should be no attempt to interfere with the transatlantic slave trade until 1808, and for 20 years. However, that after 20 years, the transatlantic slave trade will close. Now, it says nothing about what becomes the second Middle Passage, which is the being sold from the upper South, places like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, to the lower South, particularly in the West, places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. But so it says nothing about the internal slave trade, but the Constitution does say something about the external slave trade. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave, will argue that, and I agree with him on this point, that the inclusion of the clause to close the transatlantic slave trade after 20 years is evidence that the founders wanted the institution destroyed. It was believed at the time in the 1780s that if you shut off the flow of slaves from Africa into the Americas, that it will eventually cause the institution to die out. And that, in fact, that itself will mean that in a generation or two, there will be no slavery. Of course, you know, that says that there will be a delay in ending slavery. Although there are movements in the 1770s and 1780s, and not just in the North, but in the South too, to eliminate slavery, there is no, and there's talk about it at the convention, Constitutional Convention. Politically, it was probably an impossible task. Well, again, as I said, the revolution was not fought to preserve slavery. There's just not enough evidence to make that claim. And some revolutionaries may have participated to protect slavery, but they're, certainly not the majority and certainly not the important ones. But at the Constitutional Convention, the establishment of union, which was believed by all of the founding fathers to be the most pressing issue. And the reason why it was believed to be the most pressing issue, if you listen to my previous episode that was just me speaking solo, was that it was thought by most of the founding fathers that if the 13 colonies and now the 13 states were to be disunited, it would inevitably lead to tension, conflict, and war between the colonies or the new states. And that, in fact, this conflict would lead to the emergence of standing armies of the various states and the erosion of the liberties and freedoms that the revolution was fought for. So, preservation of union, establishment of union, and then eventual preservation of it was the priority. And slavery itself was a necessary, ugly compromise in order to create that union or reestablish that union on better terms in 1787. But in order to do that, they had to sign a document. And the document had to be agreed to by slave owners, just like it was agreed to by non-slave owners. And it had to be ratified by all of the various states, some of which were slave states. So in order for the Constitution to be broadly acceptable, it could not directly attack slavery. I mentioned, and that in fact further compromise was needed other than just the transatlantic slave trade. But that, and I'll continue. The Constitution implies slavery in two other places. One is with the famous 3/5 clause, which related to congressional apportionment, in that when counting when counting up populations in order to create congressional seats, slaves would count as 3/5 of a person. Now, it doesn't actually say slaves. It gives you a whole bunch of categories of people. But I think it's generally understood that it's referring to slaves. Frederick Douglass, again, in his claim that the Constitution is anti-slavery and not pro-slavery, argues that the 3/5 clause is evidence of the anti-slavery nature, because if Southerners or if slave owners wanted the full power in Congress that they should have been entitled to, that they believed themselves entitled to, they should have freed their slaves, therefore making them 5/5 and one whole person rather than just 3/5. Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting point. And that it was an incentive to free your slaves if you wanted more power for your region. However, what if, and this is going to happen later, not so much in the 1780s and 1790s, but what if the reason you want power for your region is to protect slavery? The other place, by the way, that it is mentioned in the Constitution is the Fugitive Slave Clause. Again, it does not specifically mention slaves. There was real attempt by the founders, by the people crafting the Constitution, that they did not want the word slavery to be in the Constitution. I think they generally believed that they were creating a document to preserve liberty. A document to preserve liberty that had to account for slavery until the institution died out of its own, died out was the hope. But doesn't die out. Why doesn't it die out? Well, part of it's changes in the global economy. Part of it's changes in technology. There's two major things that I'll mention. One is that in the late 1780s and early 1790s, Richard Arkwright's patents for the various machines that you use to create to run a textile mill run out, and so they become in the public domain. And of course, some of technology has been stolen earlier, and industrial espionage and whatnot. But in the 1790s, all of a sudden, you have this great proliferation of textile mills across Lancashire in Britain. Um, and so there's this enormous demand for cotton, and particularly not the long, stable, finer strand of cotton that had been that existed inside the British Empire, particularly places like India, um, provided. In the United States, cotton had not been a major cash crop at the time of the founding. This really only begins in the mid 1790s with the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. All of a sudden, this, along with some innovation on the biological side, allows for upland short staple cotton to be grown across the South. Basically, what it allows it to do is to endure more frost nights than it had previously. And then the cotton gin basically allows for the processing of cotton to be a lot more efficient. And so overnight, this significant larger demand for cotton in Lancashire, cotton that really did not exist in the 1790s, combined with some innovations in the American South, including Eli Whitney's cotton gin, allows for slavery to get a new lease on life. And all of a sudden, the way to wealth in the South was through cotton. Moving west in order to start a cotton farm, and then purchasing slaves to labor on that farm, and if you were really lucky, on a plantation, which is, of course, the, um, the crux of the question that will define the Civil War. But we're not to talk about the Civil War. The purpose is to talk about the Constitution. So the the Constitution was written in a period before this great proliferation of cotton farming. In that period, the great slave crops of the South, other than tobacco, but even tobacco, were dying out. and that farming in the South tended to be adopting more grain farming, more wheat farming. And the way that grain was farmed and wheat was farmed by the 1790s, slave labor was becoming increasingly unprofitable to do it. So again, there was reason to believe, there was reason to be hopeful in the 1770s and 1780s that slavery itself might die out on its own. It is not it we might be able to sit here from the year 2025 and criticize the founders for being so naive to imagine that something like slavery could be could die out on its own. But what was the alternative in the 1780s? If it wasn't going to die out on its own, and if you weren't going to hope and wish and expect it to die out on its own, then you were going to have to prepare to fight a civil war. And of course, in the 1780s, most of the states, including the northern states, are slave states. It's not just southern states being slave and northern states being free. Most of the states are slave states. But it's pretty clear that in the North, while slavery exists, it is I don't want to say it's a marginal part of the economy, but it is not the primary focus of the economy like it is in the South. But that is, and that is that process of in the North, slavery dying out is accelerating. Whereas in the South, it appears to be moving that direction, but it's about to recover and significantly accelerate the other way. Um, but at the convention, while there were a great many anti-slavery voices there, such as Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, if they wanted a union, if they wanted a non-slave holding union of all the states, a war was going to have to be fought to free the slaves, which it eventually was. But in the 1780s, while there was still hope that it might die out on its own, I can understand not wanting to go to war and maybe being even a little optimistic about the possibilities that slavery was going to die out on its own. In addition, there was other ways that slavery could die out. What does dying out on its own look like? I mean, I think that's the right question to ask. And guys had ideas. Some of these men had ideas as to what that looked like. In the British Empire, for instance, in the 1830s, you will get the abolition of slavery. How do they manage to convince slave owners to give up their slaves? Well, the British government compensates them. It buys them, basically, buys their freedom for them. And that allows slave owners, although many of them will grumble about it, it will allow them at least some recuperation of the capital that they'd invested into their slave labor force. Yeah, it's hard to think in these such cynical terms, but this was the reality of making public policy in a world where slavery existed. So there was the hope of compensated manumission or compensated emancipation. And I think, and Thomas Jefferson himself believed that the only way slavery was ever going to be abolished in the United States was for slave owners themselves to vote to get rid of it. And he believed that that would happen. I think he was wrong, but he believed that that would happen. One of the reasons it probably does not happen, aside from the vast profits that could be made with slaves, was that, and I'm going to quote Jefferson again here, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale, is in one scale and self-preservation in the other. Thomas Jefferson believed that the situation was such that there was almost nothing you could do. They were worried that if the slaves were immediately emancipated, they would perhaps take out vengeance on their former owners and their families. But there was also fear that if they continued to hold them, the same would happen. And we see that in the 1790s in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. Part of the Haitian Revolution involves a slave rebellion where slaves rise up against the landlord class, and they are, frankly, there's a lot of massacre. There's a lot of bloodletting. This will only harden the hearts of slave owners who believe that the only way to make them keep themselves safe is to tighten the discipline and tighten the control through which they hold their slave labor force. But in the North, slavery will die out. Why is that? Well, as I mentioned, the economy just no longer really suited it. And if you were a slave owner, at least while slavery was still legal in the North, there were places you could sell your slave into the South. So, you might have fewer slaves in a northern state, but a lot of the people who had previously been slaves are still slaves, just in a different state. All of this is to say that the problem of slavery at the Constitution was as naughty of one as you are likely ever to find. This notion of a pro-slavery constitution is a very old one. Most famously, it was advocated for by a man named William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was a newspaper publisher in Boston, Massachusetts, and he might have been the most prominent abolitionist in the antebellum period. He was certainly the most polemical, and arguably, I'm not sure about most effective. Harriet Beecher Stowe might have been more effective with Uncle Tom's Cabin, but pretty close to one of the most effective. And he believed that the Constitution itself was the problem. And he believed that the North should separate from the South and establish their own constitution on better principles. He, in a preamble to a lecture he gave on this, he said, "The American Union is the supremacy of the Bowie knife, the revolver, the slave driver's lash, and lynch law over freedom of speech, of the press, of conscience, of locomotion in more than one half of the nation, and the degrading vassalage of the entire North to the accursed slave power. That no other union has existed since the adoption of the United States Constitution, and that such a constitution is to be resisted, denounced, and repudiated by every lover of liberty until its utter overthrow shall be consummated, and that to effect this glorious object, there should be one united shout of no union with slaveholders, religiously or politically." Religiously, what he means is that there's some debate at the time, particularly among various national denominations like Methodism, Episcopalianism, as to whether there should be one, church body that governs the denomination in America, or whether there should be a northern one and a southern one and this is all over the issue of slavery. Um, Garrison brings up the three things that I mentioned earlier that are in the Constitution, and he makes a very compelling argument. But ultimately, I think Garrison's mistake when he was writing in the 1850s, particularly in the 1850s, is that he was confusing a constitution that had, before the Civil War, become anti-slavery, become a pro-slavery document, as opposed to one that had been intended as one. I don't believe the Constitution was intended as a pro-slavery document, but because of the power of prominent Southerners, particularly on the Supreme Court, in the administration of the Supreme Court, by the 1850s, it was functioning as one. In 1857, with the Dred Scott decision, Judge Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and issues the majority opinion in the Dred Scott case, he specifically turns the Constitution into a pro-slavery document. If there'd been any questions before 1857, those questions were answered in 57 with the Dred Scott decision. And what Taney does is he establishes that slaves aren't property, and that the United States government has no power to deny men their holding of property, and that they can in fact take their property anywhere in the Union, and that states have no real right to deprive men of their property, even if it's a free state. So this is tossed into the major conflagration of the 1850s, political conflagration of the 1850s, and will certainly be a precursor to war. So if it's 1858 that we're talking about, the Constitution is, I would argue, it becomes a pro-slavery document. However, it becomes an anti-slavery document officially an anti-slavery document 7 years later, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. So, can it be argued that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document? I think, yes, it can be, particularly between 1857 and 1865. And earlier, to some degree, it operated as such, but for the most part, it was a document that sought to manage the decline of slavery peacefully until slave owners themselves would vote it out of existence. Not to keep slavery in perpetuity. We have ways of comparing what a pro-slavery document would look like. For instance, remember how I mentioned earlier that in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, the first draft, there's a whole section decrying the institution of slavery, in fact, blaming King George for imposing slavery on the United States. When, just shy of 90 years later, Southern states begin seceding from the Union, they themselves, like Thomas Jefferson did with the Declaration of Independence, give their reasons for why they are seceding from the Union, just like Jefferson gave the reasons for why the United States was seceding from Great Britain. And while the final document made no mention of slavery, in the in the first draft, Jefferson argued that one of the reasons that the United States was leaving Great Britain is that Great Britain protected slavery. Again, that's not the final document, but it's in the rough draft. Meanwhile, when the state of Mississippi secedes for the Union on January 9th, 1861, after a very brief preamble, it says, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of the commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun." These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. Skipping ahead a little bit, there was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. There's no confusion there. The Secession Declaration of Mississippi makes it very clear. Mississippi seceded to protect slavery. This looks very different from the Declaration of Independence. The Confederate Constitution itself establishes slavery explicitly. That is a very different document than anything that is in the 1787 Constitution. 1787 document says "we the people." There's no attempt to limit what that actually means. And maybe this is the great virtue of not only the American founding documents, but the Western philosophy of liberty, is that its tenets can stay consistent, while what it refers to can be broadened with culture. In 1787, whether the Constitution was pro-slavery or anti-slavery, for a second is irrelevant. If we accept my explanation that it was an anti-slavery document, the people that were at that convention were generally pretty racist. But the words they wrote, it took no imagination. In fact, all we had to do was just read the text and not impose any other type of interpretation on it, and it becomes inclusive to all. There's nothing in the Declaration of Independence, there's nothing in the Constitution that excludes people from the natural rights that are described. Nothing there. I mean, listen, there's some legalese in the Constitution that, explains, what the role, Indians, aliens, convicts, etc. But with those exceptions, and or how long it takes for somebody to be naturalized, etc. But for the most part, the words themselves are never exclusionary. And that was purposeful. That was purposeful. One of the arguments that Judge Roger Taney will use in the Dred Scott decision in order to justify it as a pro-slavery document is that the only people who were making the Constitution as a social contract, the only people who were voting on it were white people. But that's not, in fact, not true. In several of the states in 1787, there was a large free black community. And in some instances, they were voting. And they themselves voted on whether or not to, for delegates and to legislatures that would make the decision on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. Any notion that the Constitution was established only by and for white people misses that part of the history. While everybody there in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention was a white man, the franchise was broader than that, in some states at least. And so while the social contract of the Constitution document that was flawed. It's not perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect document. There's no such thing as a perfect political system. There's no such thing as perfect, and that's because there's no such thing as perfect men. Documents and political systems are the inventions of man. But it was a far broader electoral base than is imagined. And in the 1780s, at least free blacks voted in many of the elections that determined the Constitution's fate. That means that they were part of we the people, which instantly repudiates any of Taney's reasoning in the Dred Scott decision. Again, he argued that black people were not included in it and therefore were always separate from the Constitution. It was a document that accounted for slavery and sought to create a union within which the institution of slavery that virtually everybody at that convention acknowledged was barbaric and wished to see go. That a union could be created where that institution existed, but that would eventually decline. And that the Constitution would help keep the union together while the decline was managed. You know how I said this wasn't going to satisfy anybody? For those who only want a constitution that was perfect, you're not going to find that in the United States. Probably won't find it anywhere. For those who want liberty to have absolute to have been perfectly not only expressed in the document, but for it to have actual, real, tangible meaning immediately, you're not gonna find it in America and in that Constitution, especially until the end of the Civil War, and arguably later. But and for others who want it to be a perfect document for other reasons, because it allows them to imagine that America maybe is perfect. Slavery's in there. But again, I think it was in there within as a recognition of reality, but that the Constitution was designed to manage its decline and hopeful eventual elimination. Now, again, that Constitution then condemns generation, if not more, to slavery, even with my possibly rosy interpretation of it. But what was the alternative? I don't know. Moral perfection, maybe. And these men were not morally perfect. And if you're morally perfect, that's great. I know I'm not. Anyway, if you made it through this long, I'm grateful. I think hopefully it was interesting for you. Hopefully, you gained maybe a different perspective, maybe a new perspective, or maybe just further, you were just further convinced of your perspective going in. I probably talked too much about various things that were irrelevant to the subject. But anyway, hopefully it was useful to you. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And we'll see you next time, where again, it won't just be me, but we will have some outstanding guests. Thank you very much. Take care.